Eugenie, Empress of the French, a lecture by David King. Eugenie was born in Granada on the 5th of May, 1826. Her father was Don Cipriano di Palafox y Porto Carrero, Count of Teba, later Montijo. Eugenie is often called in French Eugenie de Montijo. Well, as a matter of fact, she was not Montijo when she married the emperor. So she would have lost that title because she then became the Empress of the French. Her mother was Maria Manuela Kirkpatrick, Countess of Teba, and her sister was Paca. And Paca, who was a year older, went on to become the Duchess of Alba. Her mother, Maria Manuela Kirkpatrick, was a quarter Spanish, a quarter Belgium, and half Scottish. Her father, who was a wine merchant in Malaga, was also the honorary consul to the USA. Her Spanish father was the younger brother of the Count of Montijo. He was born in 1886, so he was 40 years old when his daughter was born. He'd actually been injured quite a lot during the Carlist Wars. He'd lost an eye and his arm was severely mutilated. Eugenie and her mother and sister went to Paris following a cholera epidemic in Spain, and in Granada particularly, where she was born. And when she was in France, she went to the convent of the Sacré-Cœur, which still exists to this day, and where, in fact, I have several friends who weren't there when they were young. She spoke fluent French, and amongst their acquaintances were two very famous literary figures, Prosper Mérimée, who wrote Carmen, the story of Carmen, which was turned into the opera by Bizet, and Henri Belle. Henri Belle, better known as Stendhal, who wrote the famous romantic novel Le Rouge et le Noir. When she was 11 or 12, Eugenie, or Eugenia, as she would have been known in Spanish, with her sister Paca, spent a year at 2 Royal York Crescent, which was a girls' boarding school. They were studying fashion. It can't be seen in this photograph, or rather this black and white version of a color portrait, but Eugenie's hair was bright red, and she was nicknamed Carrot Tops by the other girls. She was so upset by this that she decided to run away to India. Thank goodness she was rescued before she actually even got onto the boat. Because Bristol being a port, there were many boats traveling throughout the world. They returned to Spain, and then from Spain, they went back to Paris. In her mid-20s, Eugenie and her mother were often to be seen at the Élysée and the Tuileries palaces because of being quite well off. And it was there that she met Napoleon III for the first time in 1849, when she was 23. He fell in love with her. In many ways, she ticked all the boxes. Her father had been a Bonapartist supporter during the Carlist Wars, and she spoke fluent French, and she was very beautiful. He had hoped to marry a member of the European royalty, but it was not to be. They were very suspicious of Napoleon III, most of the royal heads, crowned heads of Europe, marrying their daughters to somebody who was elected to be the prince president, and then he was elected to be the emperor, whether his position was stable. Anyway, she said yes, because she knew he had many mistresses, one of whom was Miss Howard, about whom I spoke in my lecture on Napoleon III in England, who continued to be his mistress for quite a while until she was made La Comtesse de Beauregard and lived in Saint-Cloud. So she knew that he was a very wayward person, and she said to him, "You'll have me only by passing through the chapel." Well, on the 29th of January 1853, they were married in Versailles, civil marriage, and then a ceremony of great pomp and circumstance for their marriage took place in Notre Dame on the 30th of January, the next day. During Napoleon's reign, often the court would move to Compiègne, where there were great festivities, operas, balls, hunting, and they were known as les Séries de Compiègne. The Château de Compiègne is one of the best chateaus in Paris region and well worth visiting. This is the Empress's bedroom. I put this slide in to show what luxury she lived in when she was in France. Not to be the case when she moved into exile. Here's the facade of Compiègne. Compiègne is also very famous because it was where the armistice was signed on the 11th of the 11th, 1918, in the woods of Compiègne in the famous railway carriage. Here's Eugenie and her ladies in waiting by the famous court painter Winterhalter, who was the court painter for many of the royal crowned heads of Europe. Unfortunately, Eugenie had a miscarriage in 1854 and found it extremely difficult to get pregnant. But she consulted the great expert on pregnancy, none other than her friend, her new friend, La Reine Victoria, Queen Victoria, who of course we know had many children and was the expert on giving birth and getting pregnant. At the end of their lives, they were great friends, and they used to write to each other using the sobriquet "ma sœur." A charming story I once heard, a friend of mine's grandmother was in Cannes, and she saw two elderly ladies walking along. It was the Emperor and the Queen. Queen Victoria, after John Brown came into her life and he persuaded her to give up being constantly in mourning at Windsor and Osborne, started traveling abroad. And she frequently visited the part of France where Eugenie eventually lived. So here we have a picture of Eugenie in 1856, after the birth of Le Prince Impérial, Yes, she eventually did have a son, and he was born in 1856 in May 1856. And there he is at age 2 or 3 in Compiègne with his parents, Napoleon III, the Empress, and Le Prince Impérial, whose first name was Louis, so he was known as Lulu. Here are the magnificent ceremonies that took place in Compiègne. The beautiful Eugenie with her jewels. Ambassadors from Siam at Fontainebleau. The picture is by the artist Jérôme, and although the event took place on the 15th of July, 1856, the picture was not finished until 1859. It shows how sumptuous Versailles was. We must not forget that Louis Philippe also did a lot of great transformations and embellishments at Fontainebleau. Here we have the beginning of the exile of Napoleon III and Eugenie. The famous Battle of Sedan, which took place between the 1st and 2nd of September 1840, and the capture of Napoleon by Otto von Bismarck. The village was Donchéry. Napoleon had hoped with his forces to escape through Belgium, but it wasn't to be the case, and he was taken prisoner and went to the Schloss Wilhelmshohe in Germany. He was there for a year until the reparations were paid for by the French to the Germans for starting the Franco-Prussian War. Here are the Tuileries, which became the site of the residence of the Napoleonic, the imperial family during the Second Empire. This is a picture of the Tuileries, which was the palace which was between the two wings of the Louvre and was destroyed by the Communards in 1870. Eugenie had to flee for her life, and it was her dentist, the imperial dentist actually, Dr. Evans, who was the American dentist Napoleon III. And he rescued Eugenie between the 4th and the 6th of September 1870, when he put his carriage at her disposal, and they escaped from Paris. She was very, very brave. Always, she was worrying about the fate of Marie Antoinette, who, as we know, with her husband, was guillotined in the Place de la Concorde during the French Revolution. Dr. Evans was a remarkable man. He made a huge fortune by chance because his partner, Dr. Browning, another American, was off sick the day that he was called to the Tuileries Palace when Napoleon III was suffering from a terrible toothache. Henceforth, he became their main doctor and dentist. He also helped Napoleon when he had the problems with his stones. which were the thing that were going to kill him at the end of his life. Napoleon III really died of the operation that he had in London at Camden Hill Place, Chislehurst. So Dr. Evans put his carriage at her disposal, and they spent 2 days getting out of Paris in secret. And then Eugenie was very ill. All she could drink was coffee, and she didn't need to eat very much. And she obviously did not want to speak in case anybody recognized her. They eventually arrived at Deauville, and from thence they went to Trouville, and there were 2 boats available, an American boat, which was in bad repair, and Sir John Burgoyne's yacht. He was a descendant of John Burgoyne, the famous general who lost the American colonies at Saratoga in 1779 during the War of Independence. Here is Eugenie embarking on the Gazelle at Trouville on the 7th of September 1870. After she'd been reunited with her son at Hastings, they then went to Camden Place in Chislehurst, which was owned by a man called Mr. Strode. So they were renting this accommodation. However, it has been proved that a certain sum of money in the 1860s, when the Second Empire was not as steady as it could have been, was transferred to a London bank and paid to Mr. Strode. So, and the house actually was all ready for them when they went there. In fact, the dining room is lined with woodwork panels, wooden panels from the Chateau de Bercy. Just a point to show the relative simplicity of their dwelling at Camden Place, Chislehurst, as opposed to the fantastic, opulent spaces, rooms to be found in the Tuileries and at Compiègne. Here are the imperial family in 1872. The boy is now 16, and the emperor had returned from Germany, where he was imprisoned in Wilhelmshalle as a political prisoner of war, as I explained. Unfortunately, as a result of the operation to remove the terribly large stone which he had, he died, and a huge funeral took place. Thousands of workers came over from Paris because the Prince Président had been pretty popular when he was elected. And here we are, thousands of people who came to the little church of St. Mary's in Chislehurst. A small chapel was built on the side of the church later on, 1873, 74. And when he died, he was there with the sarcophagus supplied by Queen Victoria. Napoleon III and Eugenie were actually very good friends with Queen Victoria. The little chapel is still there, but the sarcophagus was removed to Farnborough. Here is Le Prince Impérial on his 21st birthday, 1877. And it was thought that he might, in fact, marry Queen Victoria's youngest daughter, Princess Beatrice, who was a year younger than him, born in 1857. But it wasn't to be. He'd also hoped to marry one of the Scandinavian monarchs' children, daughters. He studied artillery at Woolwich Arsenal, and although he was never in the British Army, he was attached to the British Army. And here he is, just before he went to South Africa in 1879, aged 23. It was almost as if he was going there to win his spurs. But as we know, on the 1st of June, 1879, the Prince Impérial was on a reconnoitering party with other officers when Zulus approached their bivouac, and he attempted to jump onto his horse to flee with the other officers, but the harness broke, the horse ran away, and he was left standing with only a pistol to defend himself. It was normally the custom of the Zulus to butcher their enemies, but because he was so brave and he did not turn his back on them, as this wonderful picture shows, all the assegais landed on his front, on his chest, legs, arms, and so they respected it so much that his body was not cut up. Later found, and it was brought back to England. There we see the distraught Eugenie, circa 1880, still living in Chislehurst. But in 1880, she decided to leave Chislehurst. 2 monuments given by Queen Victoria, the first in the place where the massacre happened, the death of the Prince Imperial at Quegway. That monument was presented by Queen Victoria. A year later, in 1880, Eugenie herself visited the place where her son had been killed. There's another monument, an effigy in Windsor, St. George's Chapel, Windsor. So this happened on the 6th of May, 1879. Eugenie, for several reasons, decided to leave Camden Hill. Bad memories, sadness, and also the local farmer would not sell his land to her to turn St. Mary's into a huge mausoleum monument for her son and her husband. On her way to Farnborough Hill, a home which was owned by the Longmans Publishing Company, Queen Victoria spent several months at Combe Cottage, the home of the Baring family, who were the bankers of the imperial family. It's interesting to note that the bankers of the French royal family, Louis Philippe and company, was Coutts, which is also the royal bankers to this day, and Barings were the bankers of Napoleon III. Farnborough Hill, a magnificent house, which was added to and embellished by Queen Victoria, by Eugenie. There was also other land round there where she established the monastery of St. Michael's, Farnborough Hill, just the other side of the railway track. Here she is with Pietri, her secretary, Madame Le Breton, who, by the way, was with her when she escaped from Paris, was her reader. In other words, used to read novels to her. And the other gentleman, we think, is Primoli, who was the chauffeur, quite elderly. It is also interesting to note that these people had been in their service for many, many years and were at Farnborough, Chislehurst, as well as being in Farnborough. She had another residence, Villa Cyrnos, Cap Martin, which was built in 1892. And it was here that Queen Victoria would often visit. Cap Martin is between Roquebrune, between Menton and Roquebrune and Monaco. The area at one time was part of the Monégasque, the country of Monaco. The Principality of Monaco actually owned Menton, Aise, Roquebrune, but it was during the plebiscite of 1859, after the Battle of Solferino, 1860, that the citizens of Roquebrune and Cap Martin decided that they would become part of France. This is a picture of Eugenie circa 1914. Now, interesting to note that the Prince Impérial was possibly one of the suitors of Princess Beatrice. Princess Beatrice's daughter was Eugenia. She was Eugenia, the daughter of Prince Henry of Battenberg, who died 11 years after the Prince Imperial in Africa, died of malaria. Eugenia became a Catholic and she studied Catholicism with Eugenie in 1906, because she married the King of Spain in 1907. And there was quite a lot of objection to this marriage because the Spaniards were very afraid that she may have brought haemophilia. Well, as a matter of fact, their first child was a haemophiliac. They were very afraid because, of course, there was the worry about, well, they didn't know so much about the Tsar at the time, but they certainly knew about Prince Leopold, who died of haemophilia after he tripped over and banged his leg at Cannes when he was going to La Croisette, to the yacht club. So she became the Queen of Spain, wife of Alfonso XIII. One of the main objections to the marriage of Eugenie to the Prince Imperial was the question of religion. Queen Victoria was very anti-Catholic. Much of this was caused by Albert, who really did not like Catholics at all. So really, until the death of Queen Victoria, it would have been impossible for them to marry. Eugenie had many yachts in her lifetime, the imperial yachts. There are at least 3 or 4. On one yacht, she went down the Suez Canal when it was opened. Her cousin by marriages was none other than Ferdinand de Lesseps, the architect of the Suez Canal. And the procession of boats was led by Eugenie on the imperial yacht. Not this yacht. This yacht was the Thistle, which she lent to the British Navy during the First World War. This is a really interesting picture. Here she was in Bergen and meeting none other than the Kaiser. This was 1907, August 1907. Le Petit Journal reports it. So there's the imperial yacht. As a matter of fact, when she crossed from Trouville to Ryde, when she escaped France in 1870, the storm was absolutely awful and everybody was ill, not the Empress. She didn't mind rough seas, very good sailor. She also visited, it is thought, regularly the Chateau of Arenenberg, with the home of La Reine Hortense, and where Prince Louis Napoleon, her late husband, had spent his youth, near on Lake Constance. And in fact, it is one of the places that people in Constance go to visit regularly. The death at the Lyria Palace in 1920, her last journey. She died on the 11th of July, 1920. So, like, she was 94 when she died. And there she is, surrounded by her family at the Lyria Palace, Madrid. She had just undergone a cataract operation without anesthetic, I understand, so that she could see her relatives for the last time. Well, it was the last time, because as a result of the operation and the shock that she'd suffered, she died. The remains were brought back by train and boat from Madrid, and here we see the coffin at Madrid railway station. During the First World War, Eugenie had turned her home, Farnborough Hill, which later became Farnborough Hill School for Girls in 1923. After her death. In fact, she had been instrumental in founding another girls' school in Farnborough, another girls' Catholic school. And after her death, the house that I showed you, Farnborough Hill, her residence became a girls' school. But in the First World War, her home became a hospital. So the British Army were pretty indebted to her. So she had a state funeral in Farnborough at the abbey which she founded. The abbey was founded so that masses could be said for her son and her husband, and it was built between 1883 and 1888. So what do we see in this picture? We see the gun carriage supplied by the British Army with the Union Jack, the service with her coffin covered in the imperial flag, and in the front row can be seen Queen Mary, and although his head is moving, that's King George V. We see outside Alfonso XIII, Queen Mary, George V, and I think that might well be the Queen of Spain, Eugenie. Eugenia. Any people who are aficionados of sherry, there's a very famous dry white sherry called La Ina, which is the abbreviated form of Eugenia. Here's the wonderful Farnborough Abbey, which we will be visiting in the not too distant future. Architect was Hippolyte Détailleur, who's also responsible for the Rothschild mansion of Wadston in Bucks. And the organ, which is behind the high altar, is by Cavalier Coll, very famous organ builder. So we see St. Michael's Abbey, Farnborough, interior, and the monastery where retreats are organized. In the crypt is the sarcophagus, which was brought from Camden Place, or rather St. Mary's, Camden. It was supplied by Queen Victoria, and it came to Farnborough to rest in the crypt, which in fact was the reason that the place had been built. The Prince Imperial, born on the 16th of March, died on the 6th of June, 1879. Here is the crypt with Father Cuthbert, who is the Father Prior, in front of Eugenie's sarcophagus. This is the end of the lecture. Thank you very much for your attention.